My name's Sean Franzel. I'm a associate professor of German here at the University of Missouri. Very pleased to have three guest panelists here, folks who have thought about German American history and heritage quite a lot, and also done a lot to communicate these issues to the broader public. And I will introduce our panelists here in a sec. Let me just do a quick plug for any MU students in the audience. I'm going to be teaching a course here. I've just shared my screen here. Hopefully you guys can see it. A course next spring, looking at the cultural history of Germans in Missouri. So anyone interested in learning more about this kind of issue, these kind of issues, please feel free to contact me or Kristen Kopp, who's I'm going to be co-teaching the course with. Yeah, so that's a little bit of a sort of shameless plug, but let me just open up the before I introduce our panelists here, and to test the webinar function. For all of the attendees, maybe I can just ask you to raise your hand if your family has some sort of immigrant background, sort of immigrant background.
Well, and to be honest and assure transparency, I am the immigrant.
So that's most of you. What about German immigrant background? So there's a fair bit there. So the topic of immigration in the United States is sort of an interesting place where personal and academic interests come together. And the question of German immigration in particular can shed important light on ways that European and American history are sort of interconnected, but also how both are connected to wider global contexts. And I think that's something that interests me in particular, and that also interests all of our panelists, and really anyone who sort of looks into the question of immigration, whether it's German immigration or other sorts of ethnic groups. But gathered here today, we have experts on, as I mentioned before, German American history and heritage, and I'll just briefly introduce them. And we're going to be structuring this discussion around in two segments. The first segment is going to be asking the panelists to discuss how they personally came to the topic of Germans in Missouri, and one thing that they've learned and that they're particularly excited to share. That will be the first part, and then we'll open up the floor for questions and comments from the audience. The second part will be based around the question of how do you view the future of studying, learning about, teaching about Germans in Missouri? What kinds of potential for engaging communities are there out there? What gaps are there in the stories being told? And what new ways are there for telling stories about immigrant communities? Our first panelist is Dr. Petra DeWitt, Associate Professor of History at the Missouri University of Science and Technology in Rolla. She's quite active in scholarship and community engagement related to issues of American history and the role of German Americans in it. Our second panelist, Dr. Arthur Mehrhoff, has had a long career teaching. He's a professor emeritus at St. Cloud State University. He worked for a decade here in Columbia as an academic coordinator at the Museum of Art and Archaeology here at MU. And he is most recently just finished a great bookazine, or bookazine as he's called. I'm holding it up here, that he produced in tandem with the Missouri Humanities Initiative. This is a great resource here. Explore Missouri's German heritage. And Arthur also did a podcast in tandem with Caitlin and others that I highly recommend. I'll put information about that in the chat. And then third is Caitlin Yeager, who's the director of heritage programs at Missouri Humanities, a discussion partner and collaborator with Arthur on the podcast, as I mentioned. And she's done quite a bit for heritage programs and community outreach around the state, and we're really pleased to have her offer her perspective as well. So I'm going to turn the floor over to our panelists. We'll just go in sort of alphabetical order. So Petra, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, I hope everybody can see this. So the question, what got me interested in Germans? Well, as I already revealed, I am the immigrant. I am from Germany, okay? I am of German birth. My mother tells me I am 100% German. But I came to the United States in 1985 as the bride of an American GI, and he called me his best souvenir. And I did my undergraduate work here at UMR, now at Missouri S&T, and then I went on to Kirksville for my master's degree, and we were taking a 19th century American history course, and the book we were assigned in essence suggested that German heritage was or became extinct during World War I. And I said, wait a minute, this author is telling me a bunch of lies. And I felt like saying, have you been to Herman, Missouri? Have you been to Westphalia, Missouri? Have you been to St. Louis, Missouri? So that really got me interested in digging deeper. And I did it with my master's thesis, with my PhD, which eventually turned, there's supposed to be a link to my book here, but I guess it didn't show up. But I actually published a book over the subject, and what I actually discovered is it all depended on how heterogeneous or how homogeneous a German community was, to what degree their culture actually survived. So in St. Louis, there was much more pressure for you to give up your overt Germanness, right? It goes into the home, it goes into the family rather than being out in the streets during World War I, and to a certain degree also during the 1920s, especially with Prohibition, right? Because the beer garden went away during Prohibition, right? So you could no longer express overtly, openly your ethnicity through going into the beer garden on Sunday afternoons. But if you were living in a small community like Westphalia or like Herman, yeah, you did it briefly, taking it into the home, but once the war was over, it just came right back out, right? Several newspapers continued to publish in German. The Westliche Post, the premier Midwestern German language newspaper, published all the way until 1938, before it finally closed its doors. So definitely German culture was not extinct as a result of World War I, right? And what is the one thing that I learned, or what have I really taken or gotten out of my research, years-long research into Germans in Missouri as well as the United States? They are the most integrated ethnic group that is out there, economically speaking, socially speaking, politically speaking, even to a great degree, also religiously speaking. They have truly become Americans, but they also still celebrate their ethnic identity, okay? They don't see anything wrong with being American while also being still Germanic, right? So that is one thing that I took out of this. And through that, I'm also appreciating this resilience in preserving ethnic history. It seemed to, there was kind of like a hiatus, if you want to call it that, between World War I and the end of World War II. But then there's really this resurgence, strong resurgence in pride in being German after World War II, right? So that resilience is out there, and I very much appreciate that. Okay, so here's the image of the book. Okay, so that is the major takeaway that I've gotten out of my research here. So I'm going to turn it over to the next person. I'm going to stop sharing. Okay.
Thank you, Petra.
Sure.
I'm going to share your PowerPoint now, Arthur.
All right, Petra, you surprised me. I didn't. Well, I'm surprised that You're, I'll go ahead. All right. Rainer Maria Rilke advised a young poet, be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms, like books written in a very foreign tongue. Rilke's advice has also guided me while exploring the locked rooms and books of my German heritage. You might even say that my journey has been Bildung up to this presentation. Like the scent of the long forgotten cookie that sent Marcel Proust in search of lost time, my search for Deutsches Erbe, for German heritage, also precedes literacy. A yellow newspaper photo dated spring 1950 depicts mini-me with my proud parents by the venerable Friedrich Schiller statue in old North St. Louis. Growing up there in the 50s, I absorbed German culture through Sauerbraten and rolled oats bread from beloved grandmothers, hearty church dinners, family stories from Die Großeltern, Bach chorales and organ music at 19th century Zion Lutheran Church, even being called Schnickelfritz by my aunt. Over the next 3 decades, the growing orbits of my life revealed wider vantages of die Heimat. In the 60s, literacy replaced foodways as my primary research method. History books and novels by Thomas Mann and Hermann Hesse gradually replaced stories about sports heroes like Lou Gehrig. However, a field trip to historic Perryville, Missouri, with its fascinating displays of early German immigrant life, showed me a tangibly new perspective. That field trip helped stimulate my 70s search for roots. Genealogy and historic preservation took pride of place in my search. My wife and I restored a 1904 house on Flad Avenue, named after Henry Flad, a German-American immigrant, chief engineer of Eads Bridge in South St. Louis, featuring Fachwerk design, and made annual autumn pilgrimages to the nearby wine country to get the plaster out of our lungs. My work in city planning and urban design heightened my awareness of urban innovation in West Germany, while a belated honeymoon made Dahlmeyer's coffee essential to my Saturday breakfasts. Besides cafe, that 1980 travel highlighted other major cultural differences between America and Germany, especially about land use, urban design, and historic preservation. My doctoral research in American studies at St. Louis University during the 80s subsequently focused upon cultural landscapes and material culture studies, while Dr. Helen Mandeville's marvelous course on the immigrant experience in literature placed Missouri Germans in comparative cultural context. In 1986, the University of Tübingen invited this newly minted PhD to lecture on the Missouri Rhineland, an ethnohistory of the German Americans in central Missouri, as a finalist for a teaching position in American studies. T.S. Eliot concluded, "In my end is my beginning." As you may have guessed, I didn't get the Tübingen teaching position. However, the lecture notice the university posted bore the ironic word Einladung, or invitation. So I have tried to be patient toward all that was unsolved in my heart about my Missouri German heritage and learn to love the questions themselves. In that end was my beginning. About 30 years later, while working as the academic coordinator for the Museum of Art and Archaeology here at the University of Missouri, I met Dr. Steve Belko, the dynamic new director of Missouri Humanities. Dr. Belko spoke excitedly, as is his wont, about the new Missouri Humanities German Heritage Corridor project that he was initiating. And I shared with him some of the story I just told you. The rest, as they say, is cultural history. So what's it worth? The second part of this picture, I think, poses that question. That question underlies the popular PBS Antiques Roadshow series. New information, stories, and family connections often change how folks value their old stuff. The question also lies just beneath the surface when folks consider Missouri's German heritage, like this familiar scene in Hermann, Missouri. So for what it's worth, here are my key finds from exploring Missouri's German heritage. Nostalgia is history without the pain. Missouri's German cultural heritage was forged in the heart of the country during the Civil War, as well as by the crucible of the American immigrant experience. You can still detect hints of schmerz or pain, of transatlantic crossings, burials at sea, like one of my distant ancestors, fierce frontier conditions in the far west of Missouri, as well as the soul-crushing cultural challenges during World War I and Prohibition that Dr. DeWitt has described and documented so well. On the other hand, Missouri's German cultural heritage remains and somehow retains its traditional Gemütlichkeit, its coziness or warm feeling, despite those dispiriting experiences. You can still catch occasional glimpses of it in the food, festivals, a beer garden, bandstands, and the enduring popularity of the chicken dance across generations. This photo also hints at Missouri Germans' cultural heritage of die Landschaft or Landschaften. Landschaft involves a deep-seated desire to respectfully shape the land for beauty and permanence. It appears throughout this cultural region in the shape of well-designed and crafted civic buildings, commercial architecture, historic wineries and neighborhoods, even cemeteries. The ceremonial gateway in Jefferson City's Old Munichburg neighborhood beautifully memorializes this feature of Missouri's German heritage. Finally, our Missouri German legacy of reverence toward nature rejects the Faustian bargain that our disenchanted modern landscape offers us. It reveals instead an awareness and appreciation of the natural world that blends deep knowledge of nature with both creativity and a pre-industrial ethos of reverence. This ethos animates Wilhelm Pelster's earth-sheltered house barn, Georg Hussmann's dream of a Weinstrasse, Georg Engelmann's world-renowned botanical research and the founding of Missouri Botanical Garden, even Deutschheim's Missouri River setting. We need this ethos to reweave what Alexander von Humboldt called the web of life. So tell me another story, Grandpa. Maybe later. In summary, I have conclusively demonstrated that a picture is indeed worth 1,000 words, actually 1,027. Perhaps less conclusively though, I hope I've demonstrated why it's worthwhile, or at least interesting, to love the questions about Missouri's German cultural heritage themselves. In the end, the journey is just beginning. Caitlin.
Thank you. I consider myself really lucky and privileged to be on this panel, especially considering I am amongst some of the titans of this topic, I like to think, and I pale in comparison. So thank you for having me and kind of to juxtapose Petra and Arthur's perspectives as scholars and people who have written books and done research and taught. I come from more of the public facing side of things, the implementation side of things. So as director of heritage programs for Missouri Humanities, a role I've been in for the last 5 odd years, it was my job to basically take the idea of the German Heritage Corridor, which Arthur touched on, the brainchild of our current executive director, to take that initiative and really, make it happen, I guess, to put it lightly. So when I came on, it was, there were some things that had kind of been done already, but, I admit that sometimes I think Steve was crazy to hire me because I had very little background in German heritage in Missouri, which is somewhat embarrassing to admit, as I am German. Jaeger is my married name, but I am very much German on both sides of my family, though my maiden name is O'Leary, and that gets to be confusing sometimes to people. There's a running inside joke with Steve about that he hired me, but he requested I change my name in order to run the corridor, but I had already actually been engaged and was going to marry a Jaeger. So it's a joke that he can no longer tell because I finally married the Jaeger. But I really wasn't introduced a whole lot to this topic until I started working with Missouri Humanities. And I think that in of itself says a lot about I don't want to say availability, but how kind of readily available and accessible some of this knowledge, this history is to kind of the general public. Even though there is a lot, I think people who aren't really looking for it, it can be really overlooked. And this is coming from someone who has a bachelor's in history. I studied history in college, and I've lived in St. Louis for 29 of my 30 years alive. So, a very much German rooted community. So I think that says a lot about, the work that needs to be done to make this topic of German cultural heritage in Missouri better presented and more implemented. And that's not to say that those that strive to do that already aren't doing a good job, but there just needs to be more. So that's kind of, that I guess inspired me then, as somebody that didn't have a whole lot of background in the topic to really dig in and see what we could do with this initiative. So to back up to what Arthur described, which is this concept of the German Heritage Corridor. This came about, I guess when Steve came on was about 2015. That following summer, after this had been kind of worked through, this concept of the German Heritage Corridor received legislative designation. So that was a really big moment for the corridor because it meant that this was kind of written into law that this designation, this area, was legally designated. It made it that much more important, that much more real. And Sean, if you want to pull up that PowerPoint, I can kind of show you what it is we're talking about here. So when we say the German Heritage Corridor, these are I guess you could call legal boundaries of what the German Heritage Corridor is in Missouri. So as you see, it starts in St. Louis City. It follows the Missouri River, and we'll get to why. And it goes all the way west to Lafayette County. So it almost reaches Kansas City. So you see on this map, the counties north and south of the river comprise the German Heritage Corridor. And all those little dots are German settlements. So that right there is kind of the main reason why this specific area was chosen. It's so heavily concentrated with German settlements. And these are, and not just German settlements, but early German settlements. When we talk about the first settlements of German immigrants in Missouri, it was in this area, dating back to the 1830s. That's not to say Germans weren't in Missouri. That's not to say that there aren't other German settlements in Missouri. It's just to say that this area was ripe for the taking as far as like designating this as, wow, look at how German this place is. We've got to do something about it. We've got to commemorate. We've got to mark it. So that's where this concept of the German Heritage Corridor came. And this kind of leads into what we had to do to, really take this and do something with it. So it's designated. What do we do? So Arthur and Petra remember fondly, I'm sure, and Sean, actually, Sean, you were part of this, the interpretive planning process. So we created an interpretive plan that was basically our blueprint, our guidebook as to, okay, so you've got this corridor. How do we take this and turn it into public programming, turn it into scholarship, turn it into actionable items? And we created this interpretive plan over the course of several days of scholarly meetings and discussion and brainstorming as to what we want the world to know about this area and how we want them to experience it. And that turned into this 50-page document of here's what we can do. So as we're implementing public programming and creating new things to commemorate this area, to showcase this area, that interpretive plan is our guide to do so. So one thing that I feel like is my biggest takeaway from kind of what I've done so far with German Heritage Corridor, with Germanness in Missouri, is kind of it's nothing earth shattering, but I think just the story of why Germans wanted to be in this area is simple and beautiful. You know, when you look at this map, obviously heavily concentrated, and why is it heavily concentrated to here? It's because, you know, when Gottfried Duden came in the 1820s to explore what was then the western states of the United States of America, he saw this land along the Missouri River Valley that was so reminiscent to him of the Rhineland in Germany that it felt like home. So much so that even though he didn't spend the rest of his life here, he had property here. And he then went and published his book about his findings here. And that book encouraged droves of people to come to this Missouri River Valley to see what he meant. And what they found was exactly what he described. If you see in that picture, that's kind of the background of that corridor image, that's the Missouri River Valley along Highway 94, I believe, in central Missouri. And, you know, that is, you know, what people saw when they first came here. It's this beautiful river valley that is reminiscent of what they were used to. So when times were tough, as it was for so many immigrant groups, they went to a place that, though it wasn't home, it felt like home as much as it could. And I think that, you know, that's one of the stories I love, you know, telling, is just the inspiration and why this area was so popular amongst German immigrants. And Sean, if you go to that next slide, this is just to show that, yes, we know there are lots of other German places in Missouri. And I only say that because I get critiqued quite a bit on, well, you know, that big blue dot in southeastern Missouri, well, obviously that's Perry County, and Perry County is very, very German. All those other blue dots on the state of Missouri there are indicating other heavily concentrated German areas. 100% those stories are just as important. The corridor is just kind of a guinea pig area to kind of focus on this heavy concentration. We've done lots with many other communities as well. So as we kind of transition into part 2 of our discussion and get some audience discussion going, I'll share one story that has kind of been carried with me for about 10 years now. So predates my time at Missouri Humanities. And it correlates to this idea of, you know, Germans choosing this area to settle. And that is, so I have family that went to Mizzou and I went to Truman. So we spent a lot of time driving down Highway 70, you know, between college visits and going back and forth to school and all that. And I remember when my brother went to Mizzou, so this was before me, we were driving with my mom and we came up on Highway 70, or coming up this hill, and kind of as you kind of crested the hill, you looked out and it was this vista. You know, and it's beautiful. It's just wooded, and it's just something about it was just beautiful. And my mom kind of stopped and she goes, wow, this looks just like Germany. And she had actually spent several years living in Germany while my dad was stationed there. And so it's kind of like, well, she would know, you know? And so we were kind of like, oh, cool. You know, it doesn't really mean anything to us at the time, but that stuck with us so much so that for years, all these kids, all these times traveling up and down Highway 70, the Germany Hill, as we called it, became a benchmark of where we were on our journey back to school. So, you know, mom's calling as you're driving back to school. Okay, where are you? I'm on this mile marker. Okay, so have you passed the Germany Hill? Yes, we passed the Germany Hill. So that was our marker of how far along on the journey you were. Fast forward to working for Missouri Humanities, and the Germany Hill made sense finally. Yes, this did look like Germany, so much so that, you know, it kind of linked. It was like, wow, mom was right all along. This looked like Germany, and that's why Germans settled here. So this whole concept of the Germany Hill is just this fun family anecdote that eventually made complete sense to me. So it's just a fun little story I like to tell. It all connects, and I'd love to, you know, continue discussing. And if anybody has questions, you know, like Sean and Seth have said, you know, we encourage you to pipe in, raise your hand, and use that chat feature as well. We've got lots of information amongst all of us.
That's a great story, Caitlin. Thank you. Thanks to all of our panelists. Let's open up the floor here to any questions or comments that that people in the audience would like to share with us.
Or if there's anything else that any of the panelists want to follow up on to fill potential silence.
Teacher's nightmare.
There's a couple hands raised, it looks like.
Okay, Louisa Miller. So Seth, how do you enable people to?
I think Louisa Miller's hand is up from when we asked whether people had German immigration background.
Okay.
So I'm gonna ask Jeff to speak here, and I'm gonna hopefully this works.
I was just asked to unmute myself.
Yep, there you
Am
go.
I unmuted now? Can you see
You
me
are.
too, or is it just my name? Okay. Well, yeah, I appreciated your presentations. I have a couple questions, and actually I have a lot of questions, but I'll just keep it to two. I'm Seth House's old friend from grad school. I also hail from the state of Missouri and am of German descent myself. And we'll be teaching this class called German for Genealogy, and we can talk about that later if people are interested. But what has fascinated me when I've looked into this is the large numbers of people who returned back to Germany who didn't make it, who decided to, it wasn't worth it, or they missed home, the economic opportunities that they were seeking didn't come to fruition as they had expected. And I just wondered if you guys could talk about that at all. I know it's sort of going in the opposite direction maybe of what you're thinking about, but that was new to me when I read about it. The other thing I wanted to know is if the people who settled in Missouri, first of all, why did they? And second, where were they from? I mean, what were the main reasons for them settling there? I mean, why did they want to leave, I guess, first of all, and where were they from? So I'll just throw those out there for now and see what you guys have to say.
Well, if you don't mind, I'll get started. I can start with your second part first and then go into your first part. They came for economic reasons. The majority came for economic reasons. Yes, a sizable number also thought that they were religiously persecuted, but in essence, it's economics number one, okay? Because we have to remember Germany was not just one country, it was a number of principalities, kingdoms, city-states, and so on. And the economics in the 1820s, 1830s, as well as 1840s was pretty bad because they're transitioning to industrialization. So farmers are losing land because of inheritance laws, and opportunities, yes, in the cities are improving because of factories, but that is really an end of life, right? Craftsmen become unskilled as a result of industrialization. So traditional way of lives are changing. So those are some of the push factors that drive people out of the Germanic states. There is indeed a number of returnees, and the majority will actually go back in the 1870s. For one reason is the opportunities have changed because things in Germany have improved by the 1870s. Not just because Germany has now undergone industrialization and they have indeed thriving industry. They're number one in chemical industry by the 1870s in the world. They have mastered steel industry in the western parts of Germany. And of course, there is pride because it's now the German Empire. You have accident insurance, health insurance, old age pensions, and especially the single individuals who had come by themselves are now in essence doing economics 101. Okay, I'm making same wages here in the United States as I could now in Germany, but I don't have these insurance. However, in Germany, I do have those insurances. So I am going to go back to Germany. I still know the culture, I still know the language, and it makes sense to make those decisions. So that is what I have learned through my research. So I'll leave up to Arthur and Caitlin, if you want to add more.
I think Dr. David has certainly touched on what many immigration historians would cite. The concept of push-pull factors shows up quite a bit in immigration history. And there was a fellow named Karl Marx who was writing about some of the conditions that were affecting workers, traditional ways of life in Germany. So that gives you some idea of, there's some problems here.
Mhm.
But also, I think another line of research that's worth exploring is how people felt like their traditional village ways of life, if you will, rural Gemeinschaft communities, as they might be called, were being uprooted. In fact, that's the title of a famous book by Oscar Handlin. And, and so part of the attraction, besides being pushed out, there's the attraction of the pull factors that, at least if you discount native peoples and others, which unfortunately we did, that the idea of the frontier hypothesis, that this area of free land, as it was called, would be available to people, and many people came to settle not just individually in cities, let's say, but also recreate entire villages. You can go to Westphalia, Missouri, and there is a Westphalia in Germany as well. And so that's an example, not so much of an organized settlement as what some would call chain migration. A few people settled and then sent money back, helped others move. And so you wind up with almost an entire community being reorganized in the so-called New World. And Westphalia still possesses this incredible cultural identity. It's often cited as sort of the paradigmatic or prototypical sense of place in this whole corridor. So I think, Dr. DeWitt certainly gave you a good background there, and especially in terms of the economics. The ideas in people's minds are also fascinating to study. And with a wave of the cap to the humanities, there's a famous scene in Villa Cather's My Antonia. Her father was a musician, talented musician in the old country, but there was no place for him in the New World. And he committed suicide and was buried at the crossroads. And I think buried at the crossroads is a powerful way of imagining what it was like for people, caught between in these transitional forces. Not everybody, as Dr. DeWitt pointed out, wanted to hang in there. So we focus on success stories, and hopefully rightfully so, but it's also, like I said, nostalgia is history without the pain.
So is there a particular profile of rural settlement where what specific places in Germany that large groups came from versus urban people who settled in St. Louis or larger, or Cincinnati or some of these other places with a lot of German? Are there, can we make generalizations like that, going to the first part of Jeffrey Lippis's question there?
Absolutely. Walter Kamphöfner, with his book, The Westphalians, has done an intense study of the economic situations in Westphalia, in Germany. And he has traced these not individuals, but families coming to Missouri during the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. And the main argument that he makes is they all knew somebody who was already over here. So the push factors were just as strong as the pull factors, because you had letters from some friend, community member, family member telling you what it was like over here, what you would be needing, what kind of skills, what kind of funds and so on. And it's that knowledge that encouraged people then to come to Missouri. But his study is really very intensive with this chain migration that happened. And it's really the rural settlers who are coming, and they are settling in rural areas.
And I think you can, to generalize kind of, Sean, as you're alluding to, and maybe it's an obvious answer, but you can kind of generalize that obviously in bigger cities like St. Louis, you tend to have a bigger mix of representatives from different provinces, different kingdoms in what we now call Germany. Petra pointed out very importantly that this was not Germany back then. This was not the unified country as we know it today. This is very separate provinces that see themselves as a distinct people with distinct dialects and distinct customs. So when you get to a place like St. Louis and you have that kind of blending together, it's a very stark contrast to what you might see in the more rural areas. As you kind of move down the Missouri River and you see those other settlements that we see, it was far more common, and scholars, correct me if I'm wrong, but far more common for an immigrant group from a province of Germany to travel together and establish a community together. And then that community would grow because of that group that was once there. It was often started off with the founding of a church. Oftentimes, it was a certain religion, certain practice that would establish a church or a following, and the town would grow around there. As far as from where, there are many examples of town names that still exist today that tell you exactly where in Germany they were from. Westphalia is a perfect example. You get down to places like, Perry County, and you get a lot of Baden Germans, a lot of Bavarian Germans. So in the bigger cities, yeah, it's a bit of a blend of where they came from, but the smaller communities, yes, tended to be, either, obviously named for where they came from, or they tended to at least be a pretty concentrated group of people from one area in Germany.
Thank you. I see Emma. Emma in the attendees group has her hand raised.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Seth, can you enable Emma to?
Hello, can you hear me?
Mhm.
Yep.
So my question is, my family came from Germany right before World War II started, and they settled in Leavenworth, Kansas. So very close to Missouri, right on the border, but not quite in Missouri. And I know that in Leavenworth, they have quite a large community of Plattdeutsch speakers. And so a lot of people in Leavenworth who do speak German use a lot of Plattdeutsch terms, whereas other places where there's German immigrants, they don't really use those. So I was kind of wondering, what are the most common, do we know what the most common dialects are that are spoken by Germans in Missouri? And what do we know about the German language usage in Missouri by immigrants?
Well, I love that you brought up Plattdeutsch. So I don't know a huge amount about dialects, but one thing that I do know, because you brought up Plattdeutsch, is that there was a stark difference between Plattdeutsch and Hochdeutsch. So High German and Low German. And I recall meeting with a much older German someone of German descent that we've done programming with, who affectionately recounted that it was very confusing to learn German in school, because if you were in rural Missouri and you were in a German family, you spoke Plattdeutsch at home, so Low German. But at school, you taught Hochdeutsch or High German. So in school, you were speaking one dialect, and at home, you were speaking another. So the dialects, yes, very much a somewhat confusing topic. But and I do also recall there's a very specific German dialect that was spoken in Perry County. And I don't know the dialect, but there is one man left in Perry County that speaks it. And I think Missouri communities and other people are working to help preserve that dialect, because it's dying out. But if Petra and Arthur want to speak a bit more about dialects, it's not something I know a whole lot about, but I know that it's something that is kind of fading away, and That's one thing that I know that we're trying to do with our oral historian, with our programming, is to try and get some of this recorded and preserved.
There are actually quite a number of efforts underway to study the Plattdeutsch or the Low German. And there are major organizations in Iowa in particular, because so many people who spoke Low German settled there in Iowa. I think there is even an organization that holds yearly conferences in Plattdeutsch about people who speak Plattdeutsch, publications in Plattdeutsch, and so on. So it is an aspect of German history that is heavily studied. And I know the Society of German American Studies has also had some presentations on that subject as well. As you correctly pointed out, Caitlin, it was that dichotomy, that problem. You spoke the Low German at home, but you had to speak the High German in school. Newspapers also published in High German, with the exception of the occasional poem that would actually be in Low German. So there was really pressure on many communities, on many individuals to speak High German. And that also had a result on your identity, because you became increasingly German rather than maintain your Bavarian identity, your Baden identity, your Palatinate or Pfalz identity, or Hessian identity, or Prussian, whatever, right? So with the High German, then also comes this transition in ethnic identity of becoming more German rather than your original area that you came from. And Kansas actually has its own German history, because several different groups of Germans actually came there, including Germans from East Prussia, who again spoke a totally different dialect than everybody else, right? So who almost had a little Slavic undertones within their dialect as well. So you also have Russian Germans, Mennonites, who had been resettled by Catherine the Great in Russia, coming to the United States, especially, with the oncoming of the Soviet Union and so on, right? So Kansas really has its own unique history when it comes to Germans and the German dialects. Mm-hmm. So it's clearly something else to dig into. Yeah.
That's really fascinating. I mean, that these processes of nationalization, mm-hmm. of homogenization that are going on in Germany in the mid and later 19th century are also being affected here as mm-hmm. these people groups from different regions interact and coexist. That's a fascinating thread of the history.
It also relates to the immigrant experience in general, that subsequent generations not only would lose the dialect, they would lose the language. Mm-hmm. And so I think the idea of a standardization, remember, time chronology was not standardized in the United States until like the 1880s. Railroads were not synchronized. So there really is this incredible standardization going on really at the turn of the 20th century. And I think what's happening with the language there reflects that as well. Dr. Gary Kramer, the executive director of the State Historical Society of Missouri here in Columbia, has a strong interest in the preservation of language and these dialects as, if you will, historic artifacts. So the State Historical Society here in Missouri and Columbia would be another resource to explore.
And I think too, this topic of dialects and language, ties very much into the idea of assimilation. Mm-hmm. That it wasn't just trying to figure out if you're supposed to speak Plattdeutsch or Hochdeutsch. It was literal law that eventually told you weren't allowed to speak German anymore. So this dying out of dialects wasn't just a product of languages blending together or just being more exposed to more Americanized culture or what have you. It was, the fact that because of World War I and World War II, I know in St. Louis in particular, there was a it was written into law that you could no longer speak German outside of the home. And that starts to seep into the home. And Petra, made this point, in her introduction about kind of this difference between, the disappearance of Germanness in rural Missouri versus more urbanized Missouri. And it's a topic we've talked about many, many times, which is that, in places like St. Louis, most likely Kansas City, and maybe some of the other bigger towns, it was a lot more common for Germans to assimilate and for that culture to kind of start to get watered down, for those dialects to get watered down. But it was a little bit safer in the rural communities because you were more than likely living in an area that was more heavily German, and you didn't feel as threatened to be yourself, to speak your language, to practice your customs, as you might have been in a place like St. Louis or Kansas City, where not only are there more eyes on you, but there's more cultures kind of watering down the everyday practices of your own culture. So that of course had effects on dialects, on speaking German. As more generations are born and more English is spoken, it gets more and more watered down. So I think there's this kind of rebirth, I think, more recently in genealogy and learning the language of your ancestors, that I think maybe there's hope, there's definitely that want to preserve, and maybe that's enough, but we've certainly seen in the last generation a deep dive of the use of these dialects. You weren't allowed to speak, they stopped speaking German in schools, they stopped teaching it, because it used to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it used to be in a lot of schools, especially in more German areas, you were taught German alongside English from kindergarten on, and that eventually stopped. So a lot of examples of all these different factors that led into affecting language and culture.
Sounds very contemporary, doesn't it?
Yeah. Let's have Brad Nichols, historian here at MU. I see your hand up, Brad. Let's give Brad a question, and then we'll move on to the second half of the presentations.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. So I'm a assistant professor of modern German history here at MU, and I had a question that kind of flows from previous questions that have been asked in the previous discussion. Throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century, in Germany itself, there's very much an awareness that Auslandsdeutsche, German immigrants, whether they're in the United States or elsewhere, are losing their German heritage, and this is regarded as a serious problem back in Germany, that they're being sort of lost to the Heimat, lost to Germandom. And I'm wondering if the speakers here could talk about where that awareness comes from. Is it from German immigrants who return back to Central Europe and talk about how people are having their German culture or their German heritage watered down? Is it based on correspondence? I'm really interested in how this sort of transnational flow and this perception or awareness of Germans being sort of deracinated comes from for commentators in the homeland.
Great question. Thank you.
I think it's all of the above. Of course, you have the returnees who are telling the not quite successful stories as they are coming back home, right? So they're disappointed. They perhaps were disappointed that they did not have enough support from within the ethnic community itself, that perhaps that was the reason why they were not able to succeed. Yes, you have lots of correspondence. I mean, we have evidence of correspondence, but from generations removed all the way into World War II. So definitely you would have it from there. But I also think newspapers have a role to play in that mindset. Okay, so Lots of newspapers are reporting what is happening in the United States. Newspapers are reporting what is happening in the German states, and then in a unified Germany, how the unified Germany is progressing, how it is, becoming a major industrial power in the world, how by 1900 it also is becoming a colonial power in the world. And of course, the Germans who are living over here are missing out on all this progression, right? So the newspapers are writing about that. At the same time, the newspapers over here are writing about the old Heimat, the old country, the countryside, the Rhine River valleys, the old castles, and so on. So they're still maintaining a nostalgia about the old country, not the new Germany, right? So you almost have like a competition happening in the newspapers, celebrating this new prosperous Germany versus the old nostalgic Heimat that you came from, right? So you certainly can learn that Missourians, or most of the Germans who are over here, are more on the nostalgic side than on the progressive modern Germany side.
What your question, I think, relates to this the assimilation that Dr. DeWitt referred to earlier, that for many ethnic groups, certainly staying together was a survival technique, but over time that's dissipated, I think, for most Germans or Americans of German descent. And if you go through the phone book, you'll see German sounding names all over the place, but they're not concentrated in any particular region, area. And so the sense of strong sense of being German, as I kind of alluded to, it dies out unless people really want to seek it out, unless you really make make it part of what you're trying to find out about yourselves. They talk about how the dialects or the drawl of the South is now being lost in as more people move there, and the broadcasters sound pretty much like the broadcasters in Chicago or Denver. And so regional dialects also begin to be homogenized. Look at the landscape. I mean, there's really not a whole lot that calls out German culture in the landscape anymore. So I think there are a lot of factors promoting standardization that Germans are caught up in that. But also, as Dr. DeWitt pointed out, what is the new Germany? I mean, there are a lot of immigrants or people of different backgrounds than German living in Germany now. So just look at one of the soccer teams and ask, well, what's German about the Bundesliga? But that's part of the excitement as well, I think. So how do all of these things fit together? And we're looking in crazy mirrors, I think, quite honestly.
Thank you. Should we move to the second half? Let's do it. So Petra, the floor is yours again. Again, this second part is sort of centered around sort of unanswered questions, gaps in what we know. What is the future of studying, learning about, teaching about Germans in Missouri, and also what's of value to get out into the broader public awareness. So yeah, Petra.
I was looking for my tab. Everything changed. I'm working with two screens. Anyways, so what next? It seems that the majority of studies about German immigration to Missouri has focused on the 19th century, perhaps going forward to World War I But then studies began to fizzle out, right? There is very little about the 1920s, World War II. And I think we really we ought to have more panels like this, right? That are discussing what has been done and what needs to be done in the future, right? Perhaps there needs to be more effort with setting up websites that are talking about current research, future research, and so on. I also think we could and this is something that the German Heritage Corridor Initiative is wanting to do in the future too, bring the public to the history as well. So we could have historical markers with connectivity so that an individual would just hold up the phone, look at the barcode, as I call it, the little square thingy, and connect to the history of this building, of this town, of this river, and so on, right? So really connect the public through interaction and connectivity to that history. But I also think there's so much that is left unstudied. This is something that I want to do in the future myself, and I encourage others to do as well. What happened to Germans after World War II? I mean, there was an uptick in immigration from Germany after World War II, especially in the form of war brides in the 1940s, right? These were German women who had grown up or had lived during the Nazi Empire, right? How did that shape their view of Germany? And then when they came to the United States, how did that background in themselves then shape their view of the United States? Did they have interactions with German Americans who lived in Missouri, right? How did those two groups view each other, right? So most of the German Americans in Missouri came prior to 1900, and now here you have these war brides coming over, and they're of a totally different generation. They have experienced a totally different Germany. What is their interaction like? I'm fascinated by the questions that raises and what potential research there exists. Okay. And then the other big question that I have, and I encourage research into, is why was there that resurgence in pride and history in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s? What all of a sudden encouraged Americans of German descent to express their pride in being German? I mean, it's not just, food. It is so much more. Why are monuments being erected? Why is there a program with sister cities in Germany being established, right? So why is that resurgence in pride and history occurring during those 2-3 decades? Is it really that you're again nostalgic about the old Germany? There was this terrible history of Nazi Germany. We're definitely not them. Look at what great things we have done in the past. Or is it something totally different? So I think those are the kinds of things that we as historians and amateur historians should look at. I think that could be the next major great research field out there for those who are interested in German history. And I'll hand it over to Arthur.
Thanks again, Petra. There's a slide in there somewhere, John, of the Gemüsegarten. If you could bring that up. There we go. Thank you. This is the Gemüsegarten, or kitchen garden, at Deutsheim State Historic Site in Hermann, Missouri. Although this cultural artifact quite literally springs to life with careful cultivation and exceptional interpretation, many of its meanings lie hidden beneath the surface. Deutsheim State Historic Site actually excavated and restored this music garden to help visitors understand a fundamental part of Missouri's German cultural heritage, its foodways. The music garden also provides much food for thought about how to interpret that cultural heritage. The word culture itself comes from the Latin word cultus, meaning to care, and from the French collere, which means to till, as in tilling the soil, agriculture or viticulture. We know that cults can shape human behavior, even brainwash people, but more often silently and subtly shape our values and how we see the world. Heritage comes to us from the old French hériter, and it can be something possessed due to one's natural situation, like a birthright. Downton Abbey, why can't Mary have it? Why does she have to marry Matthew, let's say? Intangible values are another way of thinking about inheritance. Could be legacy, pride in my parents' achievements, let's say, or tradition, the heritage of German century farms that have been in the German household for over 100 years. So how does culture relate to heritage? Well, according to my definition, cultural heritage involves cultivating connections of meaning and value between people and groups across time and across generations. But the question, as Dr. DeWitt referred to, is how to do so. For the publication that I worked on, Explore Missouri's German Heritage, I researched the music garden and Deutsheim foodways in Der Maibaum, which is a venerable magazine published by Deutsheim Verein, the Friends of Deutsheim State Historic Site. Der Maibaum articles explore a wide range of German heritage topics by a wide range of authors. So just for discussion purposes, I'm making this up. This is not a proposal. I haven't vetted it with anybody. I'm not asking for money. It's just for discussion purposes of where we might go. I would like you to imagine Der Maibaum evolving into a web-based learning network. Some people call it a learning ecology, which utilizes a variety of social and educational media in addition to print. Deutsheim Verein, or Friends of Deutsheim State Historic Site, wherever they're located, could interact with one another via the web or in situ. Could be at Deutsheim State Historic Site or wherever people choose to gather in order to cultivate knowledge, ideas, and projects about Missouri's German cultural heritage. This learning ecology could continue to grow and evolve as its members, who are already involved in many virtual communities, carry ideas back and forth between those virtual communities and the Maibaum matrix, if you will. Missouri Humanities German Heritage Corridor Initiative offers one model of such a learning network. Many of the ideas that wound up in the book or publication, Explore Missouri's German Heritage, Cultural Heritage, grew out of discussions, symposia through the German Heritage Corridor meetings. The Maibaum also represents a traditional focal point for German Heritage's annual Maifest. I think most people are familiar with a Maifest in German communities. I think it could serve the same function for interpreting Missouri's German cultural heritage. Deeply rooted in a healthy and diverse Maibaum learning ecology, I think a revitalized Maifest could blossom into a meaningful gestalt of Missouri's German cultural heritage. Festivals such as Maifest meet many important psychological and social needs and strengthening cultural identity by reenacting its key stories while incorporating new elements. The MyFest especially honors Missouri Germans' time-honored relationship to this unique natural environment. So in addition to traditional religious and local events or ceremonies, envision a Volksmarch, bicycle tours, vintage car rallies. A friend of mine in Colorado talks about the Porsche Club there, and they're not driving through the mountains. Well, that would be a pretty neat way to explore the German heritage corridor. Boat rides, balloon rides, I think would be a great way to experience, this region. And even Amtrak, I believe, has rides between Kirkwood, Missouri, and Jefferson City. So all of these could highlight the region's natural beauty and sense of place. An extended MyFest in Herman, Missouri, they've extended Oktoberfest for the entire month of October. So it's not all packed together in one weekend, presents too much beer, and also they get more benefit from it. I think there are more ways to celebrate, and you're not going to get rained out on one event. This extended MyFest could offer an excellent opportunity to partner with environmental education institutions like the Missouri Botanical Garden or Missouri Master Gardeners or Master Naturalists, as well as to interpret the rich agricultural and viticultural legacy of this cultural region. With its strong rural and Civil War roots, I think vintage baseball could also enrich a revitalized MyFest. May in St. Louis is about baseball, I'm sorry. And so I think it'd be a great time to bring out vintage baseball. And many of these communities had these old baseball teams. What anthropologists call authenticity holds a key to festivals such as MyFest. Authenticity is defined as an existing tradition that expresses the true identity of the culture while properly communicating its content and meaning to outsiders. Authentically reinterpreting artifacts like the Gemüse Garden and traditional festivals such as MyFest can both reflect and stimulate heightened appreciation of Missouri's German cultural heritage. Just don't forget the Sauerbraten.
Thank you, Arthur, for the call to extend the time to drink beer and celebrate. There's never too much beer. I mean, that's a fascinating intervention, also because the consciousness of festivals as a carrier of cultural tradition really is a 19th century idea, and the sort of the milieu that a lot of these early generations of German immigrants were sort of steeped in. So it's a sort of harkening back to that kind of an ethos. I'd like to turn the floor over to Caitlin here. It looks like in the chat that Brad has put a link there, and I'm also, because Arthur, you mentioned that several times, and I mentioned at the beginning, this is the podcasts, and then the link to the book that Arthur's referencing here, Exploring Missouri's German Heritage. We're going to be using this book and the materials also in our course next semester. Anyways, Caitlin, I'm going to hand it over to you here.
Sure. So this is kind of where my current work really comes into play. And this is about, what are we doing today? What is it looking like today? What's the forecast for studying and experiencing German cultural heritage in Missouri? So talking about the future of studying, learning about, teaching about Germans in Missouri. In the 5 odd years that I've been kind of working on this in this field, I guess you could say, or on this topic, I've really seen a lot of growth. You know, and I obviously that's personal. You know, I personally have grown in my knowledge, but I've seen certainly an increase in general public interest in the topic. I also think in the last couple of generations, there really has been a rebirth of embracing one's heritage and one's ancestry. You know, I think the availability of ancestry.com has really, really pushed people to learn more about, you know, who they are and where they came from, you know, and the fact that it's not just, you know, the fact that you can research your family tree, it's that you can send in a DNA sample and find out what your DNA breakdown is, at least, you know, to an extent. But, you know, that's fascinating. Everyday people find that fascinating. And the more people find that everyday content fascinating, the more they want to dig deeper. And Petra, you brought this up that, you know, why is that? I've got no idea, but clearly that's something that, you know, that perplexes scholars and people in the field. Is there has been a resurgence in it being okay to be German again. We don't really know why. It just started happening. And Arthur, I mean, if you've got an answer, if Sean has an answer, if anybody has an answer, we'd love to hear it. But it is fascinating, you know, the fact that we came from this place, you know, less than 100 years ago, about 100 years ago, probably, of it being so taboo to be German, people changing the spelling of their last names. I guarantee you the way my last name is spelled on there is not how it would have been spelled in Germany. It got Americanized. You know, it's really hard to hide Jaeger though. It's like you can change the spelling, but that's pretty German. But you know, there's so many more opportunities, I think, for engaging with the topic. That's where Missouri Humanities comes into play. It is our #1 goal to get people engaged. And as far as what kinds of opportunities there are, it really depends on what you want to do. What I have found in my work, in my studies, is that, you know, no matter how you like to spend your spare time, there's a way to incorporate German heritage into it. You know, we've got, you know, Petra mentioned that we have sister city organizations. If you want that immersive experience, there are a lot of German sister cities in Missouri, a lot. Here in St. Louis, we have Stuttgart. Kansas City has Hanover. Herman has sister city, New Haven, Washington, Augusta. There's so many, even these tiny communities that have active sister city programs. You know, so if you're from Missouri and you want to know if you've got a German sister city, look it up. And a lot of these programs, you know, have exchange programs for students, or even just specially, you know, formulated experiences for adults to have exchange programs with their sister city. You know, Missouri Humanities works a lot on providing public programming, not just to inform the public about the information about the heritage, but to get people involved in preserving their own heritage. We host artifact digitization events. We've hosted 3 or 4 at this point, to where we invite the public to come bring us their photos, their documents, their family heirlooms, their stories. And we work to digitize those items to make sure that if something happens to that object, the story is preserved. And this is kind of that perpetual debate between archivists and conservationists: is what matters, the information or the object? And in this case, it's, you know, the object has an expiration date. You know, things always happen to objects. But if we can preserve the information, the story, you know, we still at least have that connection to it. So our digitization events strive to do that, and not just preserving that object itself, but we also record short oral histories with those participants, to make sure that we not only know what the object is, where it came from, how old it is, but we know what that person's connection is to that item, to make it a little bit more personal. So we are trying to preserve stories in that way and engage the public in that way. Oftentimes, as Petra very well knows, we get people that come in with letters that have never been translated, and they don't know what they say. With, you know, birth certificates, wedding certificates, even objects that, you know, they're like, this has been passed down. I don't really know what it is. I just know it's important because it's been in my family for so long. Can you please tell me what it is? And we've had people like Petra that have been able to help these people better understand their objects. One of my favorite stories about one of these events and helping people understand, you know, Germanness is our last event was in Jefferson City in 2020. And Petra was translating a letter for somebody, and it was a family member that lived in Germany writing a letter to family back here in Missouri. And this letter was written, and Petra, remember if or correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was 1941.
Yes.
This letter was being written, and the person in Germany was writing, saying that everything seemed great and that the war seemed to be ending soon.
Yeah.
And that was in 1941. So it's just this information that we're gathering as to how things were in Germany back then and how they was being communicated to family back here. In Germany in 1941, apparently they thought the war was going to end soon. And they had how many more years of that? So the information, the context that we're getting from having these kinds of programs available is just unparalleled. We're working with communities to help them better, I guess, market themselves and market their German cultural heritage. You know, part of the big initiative for this German Heritage Corridor is the fact that it is a cultural heritage tourism initiative. The main goal is to get people out and exploring and learning. But one thing that a lot of these communities need help with is putting themselves out there. It's not enough to just say, hi, I'm here and I'm German, come learn about me. They need to better exhibit themselves, so to speak. You can't just say it's here, you have to try and draw people in. So that's kind of where we come into play. The corridor being kind of under the umbrella of Missouri Communities means that people in, communities in the corridor get our benefits of our marketing and our community, our membership. So we try and do what we can to draw people to those areas. Things that I think are kind of gaps in the stories being told mirror what has kind of been said. I'd love to see more of exploring more contemporary topics, more contemporary issues. Petra says we do see, a lot of that 19th century topics, those 19th century topics, even into World War I and World War II. But speaking more contemporarily of the last generation, of the current generation, and the Germanness of those generations, I do think there's a bit of a gap there, and I think that's up to those of us here to tell those stories and to explore that. I also think that there's a lack of not interest, I should say, but I think there's more we can do to help those smaller communities better make it into the bigger picture narrative. There's so many towns that pepper wine country or the Missouri River Valley and beyond that have been overshadowed by the bigger cities in the last 100 years. Their stories and their people have so much history, and they play a really big role in the fabric that makes up German cultural heritage in our state, because that's where the story began. One of the first German settlements in Missouri was in Dutzow, and Dutzow is so tiny. It's this tiny little town, but it has such an important role to play. And it's up to us to make sure that role is made known. The obvious stories, everyone wants to celebrate German heritage during Oktoberfest. That's when people get interested, but, everyone knows about wine country, Anheuser-Busch, the really obvious links to German cultural heritage. But I think the gaps are in the details, the smaller stories, those micro histories that we don't often hear as much about. And I think it's also incredibly fascinating, and we've talked a bit about this, is not only why Germans immigrated, it's kind of the same story as everybody else, more opportunity, religious freedom. It was bad back home. And not even just here to the United States. This was a time of immigration where everybody was coming to the United States. And even not just Missouri, because Missouri was a young state. It was still kind of considered a more frontier type state, ripe for development, ripe for immigration. But the story of why that settlement, why the Missouri River Country, why Perry County, why were these people settling here? What brought them there and what kept them there? I think there's more we can do to tell those stories. And we're doing what we can with the digitization, with the oral histories. And I think something that's really important to remember kind of as we wrap up and head into the last portion of our discussion is that we don't have to wait for the last generation to leave it to the next generation. We can take advantage of their stories and their lessons, their heirlooms, with the technology we have, with the connections we have, with what we have available to us to do something with the stories now. So that we don't lose them. I think that is the biggest threat, is that for some reason, this last generation, it seems that there's so much that goes with them when they go. And to try and get that documented, to try and get that shared and preserved is so important.
Thank you so much to all three of you. In the few minutes we have left here, I'd like to just open the floor back up to the larger group here. Seth, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just really struck in listening to our panelists by something that's not missing, but that's there, that I just want to kind of draw out and call by its name. There's a German expression, das Kind beim Namen nennen, you know, calling the child by its name. Is the idea of putting something, you know, all your cards on the table or whatever. But I'm just really struck by the way that the history of Germans in Missouri, Missouri's German heritage, you know, don't need to be considered in isolation, but are always part of other stories. You know, Dr. DeWitt brought up, for instance, the degree to which, you know, the story of Missouri Germans is also gender history, a history of how women come to and live in Missouri and make Missouri what it is. You know, what are the terms on which one comes as a war bride, as a farmer's wife, as you know, as a pastor's wife. You know, we could also obviously talk about foodways, and we think about the much longer trajectory of Missouri's agricultural history and natural history. We can think climatologically or in other ways about how the story of Missouri Germans is also a story of Missouri's natural world. There are even more obvious ones, right? Like Arthur also mentioned sports, right? George Herman Ruth, I believe, is still considered one of the best baseball players. Both of his parents were German before he went to the orphanage. So there is a degree to which this story is just offering itself up for being connected to other stories. And when we talk about the contemporary concerns or the present day, one thing I'm encouraged by is the opportunity to connect Missouri Germans' stories to the other stories that we're really interested in. For instance, the role of St. Louis Germans in abolition democracy and anti-slavery politics. That's just one example, right? Or the role of cities like St. Louis or Kansas City in the memorialization of the world wars or the Shoah, the Holocaust. We have major research and teaching collections in St. Louis and Kansas City that would not be there without these German connections, or which allow us to view the connections between Missouri Germans' history and the broader sweep of German history in new ways. And so I'm just really encouraged by this conversation to hear about all the ways that these connections can be made, so that Missouri's German heritage is visible as a stone in the mosaic. And as one that you know is actually part of a number of different mosaics, or can be.
I think that's a really great point, Seth. Something that I think, you know, Arthur and Petra as historians, and me as a program director, you know, we try and consider these layers of history. You know, so when we're talking about German cultural heritage, something that is incredibly important to keep in mind is what is also happening in Missouri at this time. You know, when you think about what's happening in 1830s in Missouri, when some of these settlements are coming about, you know, and then you have the huge waves in the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s. You know, how did you know, German heritage, German history, German immigration layer with the Civil War? You know, we have the fact that, you know, there's major abolitionist activity happening among German immigrants in Missouri. You know, how does, you know, so that's layering in Black history, it's layering in Civil War history. You know, and as you get into the 19th century, you know, how other immigrant groups start to come into play. You know, so it's incredibly important to be thinking of this, you know, like you say, as a mosaic, that, you know, you can't just isolate out German heritage, you know, because it's so much more important in context with all of the other things that are happening in Missouri history at that time.
I keep getting thrown in as a historian. I love history. I grew up with it, but I really consider myself an anthropologist or a museum educator, really. And so what I've tried to do with the publication Explore Missouri's German Heritage was to take some of those artifacts that ordinary people could have access to. This stuff isn't really hidden, or at least not hidden very well, and to try and look at different layers of understanding, almost like an iconographer, or however you say that, to look at the object itself, what it's saying, who did it, why, what was the audience, etc. What did it mean at the time? And then beyond that, to look at what does it have to say to us today? And I think that's how some of the great Renaissance iconographers have tried to approach it. And that was one way to try and get a handle on Missouri's German heritage. The publication just kept getting bigger and bigger. There's so much more stuff. And so we kind of said, okay, well, let's choose some objects that seem to have a lot of meaning or resonance, explore those, and the patterns keep turning up over and over and over again, like we talked about. So that layer of continuity, even from one section, really, if you will, from high culture all the way down to the duck dance or the chicken dance, there are patterns that you can find this arc from the frontier origins, the settlement, the struggle with the immigrant experience, the Civil War, a rising arc toward the turn of the century, and you see it in the Alexander von Humboldt statue in Tower Grove Park. I mean, this is kind of the high point to me of Missouri's German heritage. And then, as Petrel has shown so well, that deep dive that took place leading up to and through the First and Second World Wars, and then kind of a rising interest. Some of it, I think, having to do with a response to standardization, to mass, suburbanization. People starting to say, is there something more than this? People talk about future shock or high tech, high touch. The world becomes more and more automated, computerized, etc. And people are starting to say, isn't there something unique, something authentic that I can look toward? And I think that these artifacts of our heritage resonate. And if you get some, interpreters who are really willing to do the hard work of understanding, cultivating, caring for those objects, and then interpreting them, trying to make connections to people and their lives today. It's a hard job. It's teaching, basically. And you guys know this as well, or all of you know this, how hard that is to make those connections. And that's really what I think we're trying to do here as well, is make connections across time with this old stuff. And but I also want to point out that I think there's important contemporary applications as well. What Germany is doing with its alternative energy efforts and Energiewende, as it's sometimes called, and a lot of the things that they've done with interpreting their heritage, we could learn from as well. And also, I think there's incredible economic potential. We saw that with beer, that young German brewers now are, hey, you can come to America. You can sort of, try out, experiment with new techniques, but then they've also gone back and, here's what we're doing in America, and selling it there. So this intercultural transfer continues. But I also think that there are possibilities perhaps to try and help preserve Missouri's German agricultural heritage. Instead of soybeans and wheat, etc., that there might be demand, say for hops, let's say. You don't need, 800 acres of hops, but I think there are opportunities for niche agriculture that could be explored as well, that would enable, young entrepreneurs here to maintain that agricultural heritage, that sense of place in some ways that otherwise will be lost.
And I think there's also opportunity for something yet entirely, and that is how so many of the German immigrants actually became truly American. That is, they defended American ideals, be it as abolitionists, right? That they were thinking of the concept of a republic, and that oppressors of slaves would be totally opposite to the ideals of a republic, and that the participation in the Civil War was the preservation of those what they called liberal ideals, right? And Arthur, you were talking about the artifacts, the monuments, and the one monument that comes to mind, I forgot what the name of it was, but it recognizes the three newspaper publishers, right? Dancer, Carl Schurz, and
Pulitzer?
Pulitzer is the third one, right? And it really goes to the notion of freedom of press, freedom of speech, right? And from that concept, these Germans were at times more American than many Americans were, right? Because they really defended those principles that the United States is founded upon, right? So that's another niche kind of place for research and publications as well.
How they took the idea of Freiheit or freedom that came from the American Revolution, certainly not only, but that was an inspiration, I think, for a lot of the liberal revolutions in Europe. And okay, it didn't work, but many of those 48ers came to the United States and played leading roles in the abolition movement and freedom of the press. And so this intercultural transfer keeps going on. And, maybe time to revisit some of those lost heroes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions from the attendees? Anyone want to jump in here? Well, this has been a really fascinating discussion. I feel like I've learned so much and gotten so much food for thought. I mean, this also came up in a presentation that Kristen Kopp gave yesterday about this was the context of Black GIs, American GIs, going over to Germany and experiencing there a sense of freedom more than what they felt back in Jim Crow. I mean, that kind of but that experience of Americans going to Germany of different backgrounds, some of which some of which, I mean, it'd be interesting to know what American GIs with German backgrounds say they had, they were, how they perceived things. That was something that I was thinking about as I was hearing you talk, Petra, but also the call to really look at contemporary immigration patterns and ways that German immigration intersects with other kinds of immigration. Just an anecdote from teaching here at Mizzou. I had a student a few years ago from Bosnia, I believe, and she grew up in St. Louis, but had also spent some time as a child in Europe, and I think learned German over there as a child. So she was just this great student, and could had this sort of connection to Germany. And her dad, there was, I forget exactly how it was, but so this Bosnian girl who grew up in St. Louis, but then that had became a German major. And so I don't know, there are these sort of, these sort of webs and patterns that you guys are referring to, that include stories yet to be told. But this is very inspiring to different pathways to think about that. So thank you all for your time. I hope this has been enriching for all of the guests. Thank you for your attendance and participation. Anyone wanna say a final word? Seth, you've got your dog there. Does the dog have a question?
Been muted because there's been a lot of chaos in the living room. Sorry.
I thought you were there in the German embassy.
Well, I'll just jump in and say, Missouri Humanities has a lot of opportunities to, learn and engage. And I invite anybody who's interested in hearing more or seeing more to check out our website. It's super simple, mohumanities.org. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram. We're very active on social media. I appreciate Sean sharing about both the book, Explore Missouri's German Heritage, and our discussion series that Arthur and I hosted. That yes, did get made into a podcast because we're very modern now. So so you're welcome to check those out as well. It's broken down by each chapter of the book, which each of those has a theme that runs with it. But there's a lot of exciting things on the horizon for more interpretation and implementation in the German Heritage Corridor, especially over the next year or so, as we make more partnerships and do some fun and big things. So definitely stay tuned with Missouri Humanities for more coming down the pipeline.
I mean, what Missouri Humanities has done regarding German heritage is outstanding. It's been a delight to work with Mrs. Yeager there, and there's, without what you're doing, a lot of the academic work would just, be sitting out here somewhere. So I think that's very important, an interface with the public. I also think, I don't want the last word, but I think what, Sean, you and Kristen are doing, and Seth, is very important. If students don't get this, then we're, it's been fun, but that's about all you can say about it. But if students get it, if your students get it and continue that effort and find their own ways to interpret this cultural heritage, wherever it takes us, wherever they want to go with it, that's part of the excitement, I think, of interpreting history, heritage, weaving your story into theirs, or their, previous generation stories into theirs. And you never know what you're going to find on the Antiques Roadshow.
Well, and just to build on that, I think we also have, we as educators have a little bit of a responsibility to go out there with the public as a whole, right? So I actually look forward to next Saturday when we will be going to Augusta to do the next digitizing project. So I look forward to seeing more documents, more letters, more artifacts, interacting with the public, and help them figure out their history. Absolutely.
Then just as an MU faculty member who's not teaching the Germans in Missouri course, which is happening next spring, and which everybody who's still here or listening to this on a video should enroll in. I just wanted to say that discussions amongst the colleagues here in German in recent years have focused on kind of practical and community-oriented service learning to be integrated with whether it's our capstone course or courses like the one that Sean and Kristen are offering next semester. Because whether or not it pertains directly to the German heritage of Missouri, skills like speaking with community members, soliciting information about artifacts and objects, digitizing, recording testimonies and oral history interviews, tracking down dates and names, learning how to do vernacular translation of family heirloom, whether it's letters or I'm for some reason blanking on that, like note documents, whatever, official documents. These are transferable skills that our students can bring to a variety of contexts, even if they don't become the next, Petra DeWitt or the next Caitlin Yeager or the next Arthur Merrill. These are things that they can do as citizens. And I feel like one of the things that you'll be hearing from us by email about and at future iterations of this panel is how we can sort of put our students to work alongside you in doing these kinds of really necessary heritage oriented public service. Because I think that's something that we'd like to be able to, to look parents and students in the eye on and say, what we're doing is teaching, you or your children to be citizens. And I feel like this is a form, a form of self-knowledge that is integral to citizenship in Missouri and elsewhere.
If you love the questions themselves, you never know where you're going to wind up.
Well, thank you all so much. I look forward to continuing the discussion and hopefully drawing on you guys next semester and being in touch. And I'd love to come out to one of these digitization events. I don't think I have any skills in reading 19th century handwriting offered, though. Students come in with stuff like that, and I was like, but yeah, thank you all so much for your time. Really, this has been really fun, and like I said, I've learned a lot here, and so let's keep the discussion going. And thanks so much.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you all for having us.